You, a couple of things about Adorno and Benjamin and what their final argument was about, because I think it pertains to the reading of Kafka, even though the explicit topic of their last correspondence is an essay that Benjamin wrote on Baudelaire and sent to the Journal of the New School for Social Research for publication. I have to say that it's hard, for those of you who choose to read this, it's hard knowing that this is really at the very end of the correspondence and not very long before Benjamin dies. But interspersed in their arguments about Kafka and Baudelaire, one finds Benjamin saying, "Oh, by the way, did you mention my visa yet?" And Adorno not really responding in a timely or very responsible manner. In fact, it's Max Horkheimer who finally responded and got a visa sent to Marseille, which is why Benjamin ended up going there and then trying to cross over into Spain from there. But it's amazing that Adorno has this really fierce intellectual fight with Benjamin when he's living on very little money, and he needs the money from this particular publication in order to be okay. And it is late November 1938, and things are looking rather bad. But that said, I mean, it is kind of strange, and as I read the full correspondence between Benjamin and Adorno, I felt increasing rage at Adorno as a person. I gather I'm not alone in that view, although I continue to have great respect for the work that he's done. But I wanted to just tell you a little bit about what was at stake for them, because I think it makes a difference in how we might think about Kafka critically, or how Kafka became important for certain kinds of political reflections on history and time, right? Which I guess we've tried to gesture toward in this class. And the first thing I wanted to say is the following. When you read Marx on the fetishism of the commodities, which is a magnificent chapter of the first volume of Capital, you will see that he uses the language of phantasmagoria to describe what happens to relations between things and what happens to relations between people. And there are all kinds of phantasmagoric values that objects have once they're subject to exchange value, that is, once people are bidding for them in markets and are using money to establish the value of an object. The object loses its sensuous quality, it takes on another quality, which is understood to be fabulous or phantasmagoric. The human also, who's not only working the market, is somebody who buys and sells, but whose labor is itself bought and sold, right? Whose labor has a value and is bought and sold, also loses many of his or her sensuous qualities and becomes a form of exchange value, at which point all kinds of metaphorical substitutions become possible between humans and things, and money tends to not only to homogenize value, to make everything quantifiable, but also to produce to invest objects with excessive value or power, sometimes investing objects with personified qualities, and also, more often than not, treating laborers as labor value to be bought and sold, or labor time to be bought and sold, depending on which version of Marx you're working with. And so commodification works to transform the human-object distinction very fundamentally. Humans can become treated like objects, objects can be personified, both of them are subject to the power of money, and what money does is produce phantasmagoria. Okay, and that produces all kinds of possibilities for people who are working in Marxist literary criticism or Marxist aesthetics, since what one is tracing in certain works that are closely tied to capitalist production is very often the phantasmagoric figures. Now, Adorno enters here after reading Bennington on Baudelaire and says, look, it's great that you found all this phantasmagoria in Baudelaire. Fabulous. Great lists. There are highly valued objects like tobacco or wine that become supernatural in their value. And you can do a kind of, you can compile lists of these new phantasmagorically invested objects, these highly priced commodities, and see how they act, how they've in fact taken over human agency or taken over powers that we might once have assumed to be either powers that belong to humans or to divinities. But you can't treat the phantasmagoria as objective. In other words, you have to take an objective approach to the phantasmagoria, and you have to show that it is phantasmagoria and that it needs to be understood through the workings of capital, that it's a mediated effect of capitalism, and you yourself need to take an approach that's at a distance from the phantasmagoria, right? So that you're not taken up by it or entranced by it or seduced by it. So Adorno faults Bennington for becoming too involved with the phantasmagoria, being seduced by it, and not taking a critical approach, an objective approach, one that shows that even phantasmagoric effects are the mediated consequences of capitalist production. Bennington comes back and he says, no, that's not okay. Actually, what's most important is to explore the kind of empathy with phantasmagoria that takes place in the marketplace and on the street. And that it's only through an absorption in commodities and in phantasmagoric effects that we will be able to understand what is still living in them. Okay, what is still living in them, right? Because they're not just dead matter, they're not just objects or things, but there's some animus, there's some anima, there's some life that is still there and that can be illuminated, right? Phil, Kabbalistic echo, can be illuminated, but only can be illuminated through the practices of empathy. So one has to move into the marketplace, and one has to actually identify with the consumer, and one has to engage with those objects in order to find out what they are emitting, which belongs to their former life or a potential life that hasn't yet been fully commodified, that hasn't been fully taken over by exchange value. Okay, and they go back and forth about this for a while, and one of the arguments that's made by Adorno is simply that Benjamin lacks mediation, and then he puts mysticism in the place of mediation. Okay, now, Adorno was a little happier about the mysticism earlier on when he thought Odradek was kind of salvational. He could go with it then. But at this point in time, 1938, which is a good, 4 or 5 years after the first Kafka essays that they wrote, he's saying, no, we need historical mediation and we need a certain kind of objective presentation of the production of phantasmagoria. And Benjamin comes back and he not only gives the answer, but that empathy is actually important as a methodological move, but he says as well, this is what things have become. In other words, we can't we can't say, oh, there's a reality over here, and then there's a phantasmagoric overlay on reality. If we're to be clear about how capitalism works, capitalism has changed what things are, so that the very ontology of object and human, and we have to also add animal, has been transformed by this mode of production, by the extensive power of exchange value, and that we now have to learn to re-describe things by virtue of how they have become historically transformed in time. We can't return them to a former state, and we can't assume that there is some natural or former state that is more true and more objective than the form that they now take. Adorno cannot stand this. Cannot stand this. We need, at least if we can't find their former state or return them to a former state, we need to at least have a critical attitude which is objective, which can distinguish between reality and phantasmagoria. And Benjamin comes back and says, no, you don't understand. Reality is historical reality, and our historical reality has been majorly transformed by capitalism, and reality has become phantasmagoria. Okay. Now, this, of course, opens up the question of whether Benjamin can produce a different critical relation to this social reality that has become phantasmagoria. But it also, I think, brings us back to Kafka, because what it means is that Kafka is not writing distortions, he's not writing illusions, he's not writing falsehoods, he's actually articulating the phantasmagoric form that humans and objects have assumed under contemporary capitalism. Okay? And that means that he's actually tracing the historical reconstitution of the object field and the human field and their interrelationship. And that's one thing that Odradek is. We could say, oh, Odradek's false. Odradek's really a person. Odradek's really a thing. Oh, if we could only make things right again, we would be able to give Odradek a proper name, a nice room in the family house. Maybe he could get married, have some children of his own. The spool of thread, maybe we could bring it someplace. We could get it repaired, give it back to the mother. She could sew with it. Things would work out, right? But because neither Adorno nor Benjamin believe that that return is quite possible, nor do they wish for it exactly, they have to work with what kind of critical potential emerges out of these new kinds of texts, these new kinds of objects, these new kinds of social and cultural phenomena. And at a certain point, Benjamin says, he's defending himself, and it's not easy, because Adorno is really rough on him. Okay, I mean, the guy's been running from the Nazis, and Adorno is like pounding him on the question of mediation. Like, okay, well, I mean, what else are we going to do? On page 284, Adorno writes, he says, look, what you've done. First of all, he says, here, we're not going to accept your piece. Beautiful rejection you get from your friends at that moment. But anyway, not appropriate to Marxism, he says, because the mediation through the entire social process is missing. In other words, if you're going to talk about these phantasmagoric items, you need to situate them and mediate them in the entire social process, right? So invoking an idea of totality or entirety that might be able to give us an objective understanding. And then he says, you have a superstitious tendency to attribute to mere material enumeration a power of illumination, which really belongs to the theoretical construction alone, what you're putting in there, rather than to purely pragmatic illusions. So there he's saying, you're imagining that material objects illuminate in some way, but actually this belongs to your theoretical construction. Okay, so this is a kind of mysticism, and in fact, at one point he says that your study on 283 is located at the crossroads of magic and positivism. Right? Positivism because you can only enumerate particular things, magic because there is this messianic moment still in trying to figure out what is still living in matter that should otherwise have become dead or phantasmagoric in some way and lost its own organic status. Now, the organic becomes really important for Benjamin, and I'm just going to very briefly take you through a couple of issues here, because I think they...
I can just interrupt to make sure that everybody has a copy, because you have a pile right there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh. Who doesn't have a copy? Okay, just...
Thank you. Here, I'll give it to you.
Yep.
Anyone else? Rob? Yeah. Steve? Good. This last one.
Thank you.
You said something about Kafka texts that are in itself, like any time they are like broken. The clue is broken, or you never.
The key has fallen away. The key to understanding has fallen away. That's Adorno's formulation.
That's Adorno's formulation
Yes,
about
it is.
Kafka text.
Yes.
Ah, okay. Because if there is something in each text of Kafka that is in a way like exactly like if each text is in some way an Odradek in itself, they are not articulated, each text with the other, but yes, in a certain way, of course, there is something.
There's something.
You cannot make mathematics with that, of course.
No, it would be hard.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you could, but you'd probably be missing something.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But they are not articulated, but there is something in the air that makes
kind of resonance.
Kafka.
It's true, but I think, one of the problems, Benjamin follows that in his own writing. In other words, he's willing to have short pieces that are not necessarily theoretically linked with one another, or when he, in the Arcades project, he's willing to follow certain sequences, even though they're not logical, and they're not mediated by the idea of a social totality.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's no longer possible in the way that Lukács hoped it might be to gather all the details of everyday life or commodity life and have each of them pointing to the social totality and be mediated by the social totality. For Benjamin, there is no social totality that can serve as the conceptual horizon within which to look at all these different kinds of phenomena. And in Baudelaire, he finds that in a certain way, and in Kafka, he finds it too. With Kafka, it actually becomes a kind of precedent for his own writing, although there are many precedents for his own writing. But he is committed to certain kinds of juxtapositions and sequences that don't end up in a total analysis or in a synthesis, and this becomes increasingly difficult for Adorno. I'm just going to make a kind of final set of remarks, and then I'm really glad to hear from everybody. 295, for instance, at the very end, Benjamin says, he writes, empathy with the commodity presents itself to self-introspection or inner experience as empathy with inorganic matter. Next to Baudelaire, my principal witness here is Flaubert with his Tentation. Basically, however, empathy with the commodity is probably empathy with exchange value itself. And in fact, one can hardly imagine the consumption of exchange value as anything else but an empathy with it. Okay, so what he's actually saying is that the capacity for empathy is a way of consuming exchange value. But the consumer really worships, you write, saying about Adorno, the consumer really worships the money which he has spent on a ticket for a Toscanini concert. And then Benjamin writes, empathy with exchange value can turn guns into articles of consumption more attractive than butter. When in popular parlance someone is said to be loaded to the tune of 5 million, then the entire national community also feels itself loaded with millions more, and it empathizes with those millions. If I put it this way, I can perhaps begin to approach the image of the gun which underlies the behavior in question. I'm thinking about what is behind the game of chance. A gambler directly empathizes with the sums which he bets against the bank or an opponent. Games of chance in the form of speculation on the stock exchange paved the way for this empathy with exchange value, rather like the way in which the world affairs did. Okay. Now, okay, we understand what Kafka's, or what Benjamin is saying here about empathy with exchange value being something like the structure of consumer desire, really. Not only wanting that object, but empathizing with the value or the wealth or whatever it is, a kind of identificatory move that requires consumption or expenditure. And on page 304, Adorno responds by saying, look, it still seems to me that the concept of empathy with inorganic matter does not provide decisive resources. And then he says you really should read my latest theory, which will show you what's possible. So one question is, why is it that Benjamin moves towards the empathy with the commodity, whereas Adorno says something very different? He says, look, the only possible question, 305, we must pose now, so it seems to me, is an experimental one. What will become of human beings and their capacity for aesthetic perception when they are fully exposed to the conditions of monopoly capitalism? Okay, that's Adorno's question. What will happen to human beings, their capacity for aesthetic perception when they're fully exposed to the conditions of monopoly capitalism? And it seems to me that the one place where Benjamin comes back can be found on page 310. Where he's referring to how the commodity economy produces forms of exchange. He talks about the phantasmagoria of sameness, right? I have a gun that's worth $10,000 and you have a picture that's worth $10,000 and suddenly my gun is worth the same as your picture, or we develop an idea of what their value is, which has nothing to do with what they once signified or how they're used or what function they have in everyday life. And here he says quite clearly that the flaneur, the one who walks the streets and is open to the crowds and open to the windows, the commodities, what's on sale, the flaneur accommodates himself to the commodity. He imitates it utterly. Right? So he doesn't just want a commodity, he imitates the commodity. The commodity becomes a kind of mode of bodily comportment for him. And since there is no economic demand, and therefore no market price for him, he makes himself thoroughly at home in the world of saleable objects. In this he even outdoes the whore. He takes the abstract concept of the whore for a stroll, so to speak. Okay? He takes the abstract concept of the whore for a stroll, so to speak. In other words, he's available to everything and anything, surrounds himself with saleable objects, and assumes a kind of existence through a mimetic relation to those saleable objects. Okay. It's only in the final incarnation of the flaneur, it's a very important concept for Baudelaire, that this concept is totally fulfilled as the man with a sandwich board over his head. In other words, he's carrying a sandwich board of saleable objects, and that the head is literally replaced by the sandwich board. It's like, buy me, eat me, give me, buy me something. And then a little bit further down, there's just a brief reference to Kafka, and I thought we might kind of draw things to a conclusion this way. He talks about this state of intoxication in Baudelaire, this mimetic relation, this this imitative relation to the commodities. He says, Balzac has drifted away from him. He retains an anecdotal significance since he brings out neither the comical nor the horrible aspects of the type. For the novel, I think Kafka was the first person to combine these two aspects successfully. In his work, Balzac's types have firmly taken up residence in the sphere of illusion. They have now become all those aides, officials, villagers, and lawyers with whom Kay finds himself confronted as the only individual human being, as an atypical being for all his typical average-ness. Okay, so what do I want to say here? What I want to say is that what Benjamin is valuing here is something of the atypicality of Kay, in a way the atypicality of Odradek, but also the question of not just what escapes commodification, right, as if there's an outside, but also what emerges within its terms that is surprising or unexpected. And I'm afraid I'm not quick enough to find you the exact place where he insists that it's only by a kind of proximity, even an empathy with objects, with inorganic matter, that one begins to see or to sense the lost life to which they once belonged, or a lost life that has, is in some sense being carried furtively by the object itself. So on the one hand, the phantasmagoria is illusion, right? On the other hand, the phantasmagoria of the commodity is precisely what carries the lost life of its former state. It's all commodities are haunted, or they are all in some sense have the possibility of being regarded as remnants of a time that's not fully recuperable, but which flashes up or animates the commodity itself. And it's only through entry into the commodity world that becomes possible. Okay, it's only through a full empathic entry. And this is where he breaks clearly with the dialectical materialism of Adorno and becomes himself a kind of theoretical flaneur, if you will. I would like to hear a couple of comments from you to see where you are with this material at this point. And then some of you wanted to ask me a question about whether this fits with my work or what I'm doing here.
I think a contextual question.
Please.
I was just curious about like the story. I know this is in terms of the story with Benjamin and Adorno. I was curious to find out. I know they refer to the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Sorry. I was curious to find out like how well known was Benjamin at this time. Like, was that a well known article at the time, or did it happen way after his death?
When it was published,
Yeah, like I'm just curious to find out like the basis for why Adorno was being so difficult and like wasn't he somewhat known, Benjamin? Or?
they were very close friends.
Yeah.
And this correspondence goes over many, many years.
Right.
So the question was not whether Benjamin was important to Adorno. Benjamin was emphatically important to Adorno.
Right.
But it was sometimes very agonistic as an intellectual exchange. So Benjamin was very well known to Adorno. He was well known to Arendt and to some other people, but his publications were in local magazines and literary reviews.
Okay, fair enough.
And there were no major book publications during his lifetime. Benjamin became Benjamin after he died.
After he died. That's actually
And
so.
when I see the Circon collection or the Harvard collection, it's just, he had no idea. He had no idea. He did write an enormous amount, and maybe there was some sense that one day it would be collected, but and he was rejected a lot for his incomprehensibility. Just keep that in mind. He was rejected.
Yeah, interesting.
Yes, go ahead.
Again, I couldn't help but feel maybe in the break that when we talk about Odradek as not being a commodity,
Yes.
we are perhaps, even though we're perhaps even saying too much about Odradek,
Okay.
in the sense that by defining it even in a negative term, we are defining it still in a sense. And I feel that if Odradek has to be has to have a potentiality, then we should not take away anything by giving it any form at all. So that any words put on Odradek is a sort of definition, and any definition is taking away what Odradek is.
Okay.
I don't know.
That's great. So you feel like we have an ethical.
Yes.
We ought to have an ethical relation to Odradek that is secured by his resistance to definition.
Yes, that's...
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that's a good point. That's a good point, Anders, and I think that sometimes we get bound up with our analyses in such a way that we forget that there's also it's a painful story. Is this creature being addressed? How is this creature being described? Can we even say it's human or not? But there seems to be deep disavowal and some kind of dehumanization. At the same time, this creature has its own integrity and its own action and language. And maybe what we do need to do is come up against the limit of naming and definition at such instances. Okay. I think you wanted to talk to us about the name.
I do agree with Anders, and I do appreciate that you said that we shouldn't focus so much on actually trying to define whether the word means anything or not. But I feel like me being Polish, which is the family of Czech and Slavic, being the Western family, they're most closely related. I think it's a curiosity that I should bring it up and actually define the word, because I think its meaning is relevant to the first paragraph, and that also resistance to adaptation, resistance to definition. So it's clearly a Slavic word. It's three parts, Odradek being prefix, suffix, and the root. The suffix just signifies simply that it's a noun, it's a nominative, singular, masculine, and possibly diminutive. The prefix would be a verb, forming a verb from a noun, meaning the reduction or removal of something. Would be a component of adjective, adverb, and noun with word derivation as the basis or combination of the preposition. So it's kind of a negative. And the root, rad, has two definitions. I think the first one is more relevant. It means it's an advice or counsel. That's what someone would advise as to propose to do in a given situation. But with the Odradek, it would mean to persuade somebody to abandon any intention of doing something like definition, which seems to bring us in a circle. We try to define it so hard, but
Yeah.
once you do define it, it seems to have been pointless, reiterating the first paragraph that it's not the point, even though clearly we can find out it's wrong, it has a clear origin. So I think, I think I owed it to say everybody else.
Great, thank you.
And another definition of the root, is also joyful and happy. So also bringing the negative root problem.
So removed, could be removed and joyful,
So advise against
or to advise against.
defining itself.
Mhm. Great, thank you, that's very helpful. Anybody else have some comments? Yeah, please.
When we were talking before about the similarities, I was just reading some passage. It's also the time when Madame is literalizing, it's period of language, in which similarity is going to take a big role, and in the sphere of language. So, well, I was thinking how much, because I don't know, how much one can think about something going on between words and the right. I think there is strong congruency, and he's trying to make a theory of language that try to put to fix some strong conjunctions there. And to say another thing again about similarity, that in the second version of the German in work of art and pages technical activity, reproducibility, there is a piece that a note that reiterates, and it says something like that one imitates things, and one there are two kinds of techniques. In one similarity, you imitate things. In the other, some kind of technique, you imitate things, playing them out. So time. So similarity, but there's a big change in the concept of similarity, in which so the name, which time, tempo, not time, tempo plays main role. And then the last things, again, numerele. I think for Benjamin, Odradek is all this kind of distortion because of his so like a numerele, all these etymologies, fake etymologies, that I think can be seen also in this similarity. So empathy, I see it as similarity really in Benjamin, in this sense.
Okay, great, thank you. See, you're all thinking things out in some pretty impressive way. Yeah.
May I ask a question about queerness?
Yeah.
When you referred to Odradek as queer, and then you
That was
said...
kind of obligatory. I just thought I should say the word.
And you brought cyber over too, so that's great.
I've done.
But then you said very quickly that the text itself performs a queering.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit?
Well, just like what kind of text is this? Is this a story? You know, where does it begin? Where does it end? Does it have a beginning and an ending? Does it follow? Is there a protagonist? Is there an event? You know, it seems to me that, you know, I'm trying to say, well, maybe it's a parable, maybe it's a story, maybe it's a tale. I'm not sure. It seems very often in Kafka we get these short texts, and sometimes, you know, they're written in the diaries or in the notebooks in ways that, you know, that you can't really tell where something begins and ends. And it's not conforming to an intelligible literary form. It's not immediately classifiable. So it has an Odradekian resistance to definition itself. I mean, it's not called Odradek, it's called the Hausvater, and which suggests that it's from his perspective, and as such we have to be kind of careful what's being described and how. But for some reason it's not Odradek's story, and it can't be, he can't be the one to narrate it. And I'm not sure why that's so, but it seems to me that has to be so. He's whoever, whatever Odradek is being narrated by another, but, in some sense, displaced, disowned, described, finished off by this other narrative voice. Odradek is under inspection as a name, and then as a kind of creature. Right? So there's this way in which that relationship becomes important to understanding what we're talking about. There's no way to take Odradek out of the story, give him another home, even though we may feel like that's what we wish to do. Because Odradek is, in some sense, sustained and disavowed by the Hausvater's perspective. And that leaves us in a kind of quandary about what we're actually reading.
I thought it was really interesting because the comment came up at precisely the same time that you mentioned that to be careful about talking about the abnormal always in relation to the normal.
Yes.
Right.
Well, or is that which calls to be recuperated.
Right.
So the impulse, like, needs a home. It's like, let's think about the household first.
Or he needs a name, right? Or
He needs a name, he needs a home, he needs a family, he needs a good job. And if we immediately move to that, then we can't ask ourselves, okay, so what is it we mean by the household, and what kind of household are we wishing for him, and how is that structured, and what does it do to people, and what kind of work, and why are we just calling for work rather than looking at the conditions of work, or how that relates to broader conditions of life, or we tend not to be critical about any of those categories when we rush to inhabit them, right? So in the U.S., gay people don't very much want to be in the army, and they very much want to get married. And that's the end of queer. That's the end of queer, in a certain way, as I understand it, and the national gay, lesbian, blah, blah, blah organizations that do that don't really have D, T, Q, or I added onto any of their, they're anti-queer, and they're sick of queer. If queer identifies something like a critical approach to those institutions that we're trying to get into, it's very hard to continue to ask those kinds of questions under contemporary conditions, and also it's hard to do when people are actually experiencing exclusion or discrimination as extremely painful, right? The immediate feeling is, oh my God, let's get rid of discrimination. Let's have equality, right? Without actually asking what the institutions are or what their effects on subject formation might be, or what new modes of exclusion are getting instituted through those forms of inclusion. So, yeah, I think that, in a way, reading Kafka opens up that space for us of how to ask those questions, or how to continue to ask them even when we don't have the time to ask them, or there's so many other urgencies upon us. What we need to live in a world in which we no longer ask those questions. I think that might be its own vast sorrow. You have a question or a comment?
Well, I had a comment, and it kind of addresses this question of normalcy, or is that a normalcy, and what we just talked about, but also the question of the Hausvater. I'm not sure that the story is told from the perspective of the Hausvater. Okay. There's no indication that that's necessarily the case.
Even the first person?
Huh?
Even the first person?
Right. Why does that have to be the father?
Oh, I see.
It could be anybody living in the house, because it doesn't.
But somebody who has children.
No, because it just says that my children and my children's children in the future. It doesn't say they necessarily has children, but that still implies some ambiguity about whether there could be children, and it seems peculiar to me that it would be told in the perspective of the house father, giving Kafka's own relationship to his house father and why the house father would be performing a sort of like querying out of text in a way, or performing this type of narrative that is so ambiguous towards this disgusting or carnivalesque or even happy at times figure comical, like when it talks and stuff. And so I'm not sure whether it is or isn't, but I don't necessarily know if we can rush to that judgment.
Okay.
And so that was one comment. And then I guess the other question, normalcy and abnormalcy, and how we kind of want to get into institutions. I have this question with Benjamin about when we empathize with commodities and we look for, this atypical being that's typical in all its averageness amongst all these lawyers and doctors. I think if we think about our own time, all the commodities are meant to be extravagant or carnivalesque, or we have less like just ordinary commodities. We do have ordinary commodities, but the way we sell those commodities, or the way the exchange value works in today's age is an attempt to ensnare you by a certain form of extravagance or carnivalesqueness or something. And so what would somebody just walking through the city do today might be a question to ask versus somebody walking through the streets of Paris. Something like that.
So I'm not quite sure what your
I'm not quite sure whether it's a question or just a statement.
It's just maybe a statement.
What would that empathizing with the inorganic look like?
What would it look like? Yeah, it's a really good question.
More of
Yeah.
Like the arcades project?
Sorry?
Like the arcades project?
Yes? But do you want to say something about it?
I just, what would it look like? Maybe.
Well, the Arcades Project is what it looks like, that's true. But I'm not sure the Arcades Project can take us into the present.
Yes.
Right, so what would the Arcades Project look like in the present?
Facebook project.
Facebook would be a very strong challenge for Benjamin, because at least on the street and with the cloth and the clothing and the smell and the tobacco, you're still among the sensuous world, and so the question of what about it has become transformed or subject to phantasmagoric variation, and what persists, and is there still some sensuous proximity that indicates a former or alternative modality of existence, right? So sensuousness is really, really important to him. And I don't know, we would have to think about the sensuousness of the computer or the visual. I mean, he would have a lot to say about the visual, there's no doubt about that. And people have done that work, thinking about how to think Benjamin in the age of the digital image. I could probably Mark Anderson, I believe, is one person, and what's his name? Hal Foster has written on that. So has a little bit Susan Buck-Morss and some of her recent work. Well, I'll just say this then. First of all, I want to thank you all. I think you were great readers and great conversationalists, and this has been, it's not easy. And I know that, suddenly entering this whole problematic, when you've been doing other things, is not simple. And I appreciated your persistence and fortitude and the great, what should I say, originality and idiosyncrasy of your readings. Mine are hopefully as idiosyncratic. And I appreciate that very, very much. I think one thing I was going to say, just maybe as an autobiographical moment, is that when I was writing Gender Trouble or trying to, I went to hear Derrida give a lecture, and it was a lecture on Before the Law. And in that lecture, which was partly spoken and partly acted out, he was trying to get his audience to understand that we very often think that power comes from the law, but actually it's our own anticipation of power coming from the law, which attributes power to the law. And he talked about how anticipation actually constitutes power. And then the way we read it is to understand that the power belongs to the law, but actually what we're reading or expecting is a dissimulated version of our own anticipation. So I thought that this was extremely important. I think I mentioned yesterday that he saw kind of meta-lepsis in Before the Law. I'm not sure I totally agree with him now that I'm reading it, but at that point he wanted to say that the performative power of law only functions to the degree that people attribute that power to the law. And of course Austin thought that as well. Certain performatives could only function if there was a convention in place that says you get to say, I condemn you to death, or you get to say, I hereby marry you, or I christen you, right? Somebody has to be in a position of power to do that. But if the person doesn't have that power, or we don't attribute that power, or we deprive that particular functionary of power, then the performative fails, or it becomes a weak moment, or it becomes a pale imitation of itself. So one of the things I thought when I was then writing Gender Trouble is that we often attribute a kind of substantial reality to gender as if it exists inside of us, like there's some truth or essence that's inside of us, but and that we then express that essence in our movements, our gait, our language, our sexuality, our various bodily modes. And but what if it goes the other way around, and the various ways in which we express or act or move produces the illusion of an internal substance? Then one can't, as it were, get to the essence of, I can't get to the essence of your gender inside of you, and no one can find the essential truth as something that is an interior possession or fact, but it rather the idea of an interior essence is produced time and again through certain kinds of performative modalities of gender, certain kinds of actions, certain kinds of expressions. So I did take the idea of gender performativity from Derrida's reading of Kafka in a certain way, and I transposed it for my own purposes. But it's also made me wonder whether, as he moved to think about performativity in relation to Benjamin and the Messianic, which also has some Charles Wood, whether there wasn't always a kind of funny Messianic issue for me with the performative, and I suppose that's a kind of broader question that I'm not quite prepared to answer at this point. But as you may know, a lot of my more recent work has focused on the question of whose lives are grievable and whose lives are not, and both precarious life and frames of war. Focused on those issues. And it seems to me that one of the issues that Benjamin is dealing with in Kafka in Adorno to a certain degree is, how is it that histories of suffering get covered over? Or how is it that certain kinds of losses become unacknowledged or unacknowledgeable? And I think we could ask this question. I certainly asked it about those who suffered and died from AIDS, and I ask it still about targeted populations in war. But we can ask it about various genocidal situations: Turkey, the United States, Nazi Germany, where the traces of the loss are themselves covered over, and that kind of melancholic problem has been very crucial to my work. And what I think, and so one question is, if there is something like public grieving or adequate avowal of certain kinds of losses, does that alter the political landscape? Does that change what we might call our now time, the time in which we live? And what's the difference between living in a time that disavows destruction and whose very sense of the present depends on the disavowal of destruction, and living in a time that actually avows it and it even has modes of public mourning in relation to it? To what extent does that dispose us ethically and politically in a new way? So, so that's something that I'm reading through the theses on the philosophy of history, and one of the questions is how does a repressed history of destruction break through a present that is dedicated to its foreclosure? And how does that change our idea of time? And how does that change our idea of who we are, or where we come from, or our multiple trajectories, genealogies, and even make us think in different ways about what it means to translate between different histories, especially as they come together in contemporary, we might call plurality, diversity, multiculturalism. So yeah, the stuff, for a long time I've been working on melancholy as disavowed loss and what effects that has on subject formation. But one could ask about those disavowed losses or even disavowed forms of suffering or destruction that become constitutive of the present and upon which the present depends, and how time and history changes once they break through. How do they break through? In what way? And what forms of acknowledgement actually reconstitute our understanding of the time in which we live and who we might be. So I guess that's a kind of simple answer for what I'm doing. Maybe it links up with the person from Gender Trouble, who some of you may have known. And I think with that, I'm actually going to let you go early because I have to prepare my talk. Bracha and I are both preparing something for tonight. And I would appreciate the extra 14 minutes.